Why you wouldn't survive in feudal Japan. When people today think about feudal Japan, their minds often drift to serene images. A lone samurai standing beneath cherry blossoms, his katana glinting in the morning sun. A geisha moving gracefully through the paper lantern-lit streets of Kyoto. Peasants working peacefully in rice paddies that ripple like green silk beneath the wind, and majestic castles rising above rivers like something from a storybook painting. These images, fueled by countless films, video games, and novels, shape an illusion that feudal Japan was a land of honor, beauty, and timeless tradition. Yet, if you were suddenly dropped into that world, stripped of all the comforts of modern life, you would quickly discover that behind the elegance of painted screens and temple gardens lay a society built on crushing hierarchy, unyielding expectations, constant violence, and daily struggles for survival. The romanticized version of Japan you know today is largely the product of hindsight, shaped by art and storytelling that celebrate the fragments of beauty left behind. The samurai are often cast as noble knights, protectors of the weak, paragons of loyalty and justice. But the reality was far less idyllic. Samurai were not just warriors who defended their lords, they were also enforcers of brutal laws, wielders of unchecked power, and often ruthless in their dealings with commoners. They carried the legal right to cut down peasants in the street if they felt disrespected, a privilege that put every ordinary person at risk of sudden, senseless death. As for the peasants, the vast majority of the population, life was nothing like the tranquil rice field scenes that come to mind. Their days were marked by backbreaking labor from before dawn until after sunset, their livelihoods at the mercy of unpredictable weather, famine, and the insatiable demands of local lords who taxed them mercilessly. A poor harvest meant not just hunger but starvation, and there was no safety net, no aid system, no second chances. A bad year could mean entire villages collapsing into ruin. For townsfolk and merchants, life was hardly freer. Though merchants eventually grew wealthy in some areas, for much of feudal Japan's history they were ranked low on the social ladder, beneath peasants, beneath artisans, beneath the warrior class. Their wealth could not protect them from scorn, regulations, or arbitrary confiscation by officials who viewed their rise with suspicion. Even wealth, in a rigidly hierarchical society, did not guarantee survival, let alone freedom. If you imagine stepping into feudal Japan as a traveler, you would not find a welcoming land eager to share its traditions. You would find isolation, suspicion, and danger at every turn. Foreigners who arrived on Japanese shores without proper sanction often faced immediate execution. Even if you somehow slipped into society, you would stick out in language, manner, and behavior. Every custom was bound by ritual and expectation: how to bow, how to speak, how to address someone of higher rank. To misstep in etiquette was not a trivial faux pas. It could provoke outrage, punishment, or worse. Survival required not only physical endurance but also a deep, ingrained understanding of culture that you simply would not have as an outsider. And even if you managed to imitate the right gestures and phrases, you would still face the unforgiving realities of the time. No modern medicine to heal your sicknesses, no law to protect you from injustice, no sanitation to shield you from disease. A simple cut could turn septic and kill you. A harsh winter could leave you without food. A petty insult could cost you your life. The illusion of feudal Japan's beauty exists because, centuries later, we can sift through the ruins and preserve what was artistic, refined, or inspiring. We admire the poetry of Matsuo Basho without having to live through the hunger he endured on his travels. We admire the castles of daimyo without standing beneath their walls as peasants forced to build them. We marvel at the elegance of geisha culture without reckoning with the rigid roles and hardships of the women bound to it. We bow to the principles of Bushido, forgetting that it demanded blood, sacrifice, and obedience without question. For the people who actually lived there, beauty was not a guarantee. It was a fleeting moment carved out against a backdrop of hardship. The cherry blossoms might bloom, but they did so over fields where peasants labored endlessly, or over battlefields where corpses rotted. The tea ceremony might bring peace to a lord's chamber, but outside the gates, villagers struggled to bring in enough rice to pay taxes. The haiku might celebrate the turning of seasons, but those same seasons often brought hunger, disease, and death. And then there is the matter of law. Modern people, accustomed to courts and rights and appeals, would find Japan's feudal justice terrifying. Trials were not about fairness, they were about maintaining order and hierarchy. Punishments were brutal, ranging from flogging to execution by decapitation, crucifixion, or boiling. Public displays of suffering were meant to terrify others into submission. The idea of individual freedom simply did not exist. You were not a person with rights. You were a subject bound to your role in society, whether samurai, peasant, artisan, or merchant. If you were unlucky enough to be born a woman in feudal Japan, your life would be even more constrained. Marriage was not a matter of choice but duty, often arranged to solidify alliances or family survival. Women were expected to be obedient, silent, and loyal, with little chance of education or independence. While exceptions existed, particularly among women of samurai families who sometimes had martial training, the majority of women were confined to domestic spheres, their fates tied to their fathers, husbands, or sons. Even spirituality, which might seem like a refuge, could be a burden. Buddhism and Shinto provided frameworks for meaning, but they also reinforced the acceptance of suffering and hierarchy. To be born into hardship was often seen as karma from past lives, making your struggles not something to be changed, but something to be endured with dignity. For someone from the modern world, used to the idea of social mobility or personal freedom, this fatalistic mindset would feel suffocating. So, why wouldn't you survive in feudal Japan? The answer begins here with the truth that the world you imagine is not the one you would face. You would not be living in a painting, a poem, or a film. You would be living in a world where beauty existed alongside brutality, where honor demanded obedience, where survival depended not on your dreams or ambitions but on your place in a rigid, merciless hierarchy. The romanticism of the samurai's sword, the elegance of the tea ceremony, the fleeting blossoms of spring, all of these would be drowned out by the relentless struggle to simply endure. This was a world where every breath was measured, every act scrutinized, and every mistake punished. And for an outsider dropped into its depths, survival would not be a matter of skill or cleverness, it would be almost impossible. Feudal Japan was not just a land of warriors and castles, it was a society carved into layers as rigid as stone. Every person had a place, every role was defined, and movement between classes was nearly impossible. For someone accustomed to the freedoms of modern life, this stratified world would feel like a cage with invisible walls. To survive, you would have to understand your place within the pyramid of power, yet no matter where you landed, the odds would be stacked against you. At the very top stood the emperor, the divine figurehead said to descend from the sun goddess Amaterasu. Yet despite this sacred lineage, by the height of the feudal era the emperor wielded little real power. He was more a symbol than a ruler, cloistered in Kyoto, presiding over rituals and courtly ceremonies while the true authority rested elsewhere. For you, the emperor would be an untouchable presence, distant, revered, and irrelevant to your survival. You would never see him, never speak to him, and his decrees would have little bearing on the dirt beneath your feet. The real power resided with the shogun, the military dictator who controlled the land, the armies, and the lords beneath him. The shogunate system, established by the Minamoto clan in the late 12th century, transformed Japan into a nation ruled not by spiritual authority but by the sword. The shogun's word was law, enforced by a vast network of daimyo, regional lords who ruled their provinces like kings. If you were an outsider, the shogunate would view you with suspicion, perhaps even hostility. The closed nature of Japanese society meant that foreigners were rarely welcomed, and those who violated the borders often paid with their lives. Beneath the shogun and daimyo were the samurai, the warrior class. To modern eyes, samurai are often portrayed as noble protectors, but in reality, they were the enforcers of feudal order. They lived by a strict code of loyalty to their lord, and their position gave them privileges unimaginable to commoners. Samurai carried the legal right of kirisut gomen, the authority to cut down anyone of lower status who disrespected them, even in the smallest way. A wrong word, a misstep in etiquette, or even a sideways glance could be interpreted as an insult, and your life could end in the blink of a blade. For you, living near samurai would be like walking across thin ice, never knowing when it might crack beneath your feet. Samurai were not only warriors but also administrators, tax collectors, and symbols of authority. They lived off the labor of peasants, receiving stipends of rice while commoners toiled endlessly in the fields. Their armor and swords, admired today as works of art, were forged from the sweat and suffering of those beneath them. To survive among samurai, you would have to bow, obey, and silence every instinct for equality or independence. Below the samurai were the farmers and peasants, who made up the bulk of Japan's population. On paper, peasants were considered higher than merchants and artisans because they produced food, the lifeblood of the nation. In practice, however, they endured crushing burdens. Farmers were tied to their land, forbidden from leaving without permission. They faced backbreaking labor under the sun, working from dawn until nightfall, only to see much of their harvest seized as taxes. A bad crop could mean starvation not just for them but for their families, while their lords continued to live in relative comfort. If you found yourself in this class, survival would demand endless toil and complete submission. Next came the artisans. These were the blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, and craftsmen who created the goods that sustained daily life. They enjoyed some degree of respect, particularly skilled swordsmiths or artisans who produced fine lacquerware and pottery. Yet they too were bound by rules, often tied to specific guilds or domains, unable to freely move or pursue their craft without oversight. An outsider without skills in traditional crafts would have little chance of integrating into this class. At the very bottom of the social ladder were the merchants. Ironically, though merchants were often wealthy, they were ranked lowest in status because they did not produce anything tangible. Their wealth came from trade and exchange, which the ruling elite viewed as parasitic. Merchants were subject to heavy restrictions, often forced to fund the luxuries of the samurai class through loans that could be called in or dismissed at the whim of the powerful. Over time, merchants in urban centers like Osaka and Edo grew influential, but during much of the feudal era, their lowly status was a stigma they could not escape. And then there were those beneath even the lowest rungs of society, the outcast. Known as burocumen or ita, these individuals performed tasks considered impure: butchering animals, tanning hides, handling the dead. They lived segregated lives, shunned by mainstream society, treated as unclean. If you somehow slipped into Japan without connections or a place in the hierarchy, you might find yourself forced into this role, condemned to live as an untouchable. Survival here meant enduring not just poverty and hardship but constant humiliation and ostracism. The rigidity of this hierarchy cannot be overstated. Unlike in modern times where social mobility is possible through education, ambition, or luck, feudal Japan offered almost no escape from the class you were born into. A peasant remained a peasant. A merchant remained a merchant. Rarely, a samurai family in disgrace might fall into poverty, or a wealthy merchant might gain influence through clever deals, but for the vast majority, life was a fixed sentence. For a modern person used to the idea of reinventing oneself, this lack of freedom would be suffocating. Imagine being born a farmer's child, your entire future already mapped out, your labor owed to a lord you would never meet, your survival dependent on rice harvests and weather patterns you could not control. Or imagine being born a woman in a merchant family, your marriage decided for you, your movements restricted, your role defined by duty rather than choice. Even if you somehow landed among the samurai, survival would not be easier. You would be bound by Bushido, the warrior's code, which demanded loyalty unto death. Failure, dishonor, or disobedience could mean ritual suicide, seppuku, a gruesome act in which you disemboweled yourself with a short blade to atone for your shame. The pressure to live up to ideals of loyalty and honor was crushing, leaving little room for individual will. And this system was not merely cultural, it was enforced with brutality. Laws and punishments reinforced the hierarchy at every level. Peasants who resisted taxes could be executed. Artisans who defied guild rules faced ruin. Merchants who overstepped their bounds saw their wealth confiscated. Even the samurai were not safe from the wrath of their lords. A displeased daimyo could strip them of their status, leaving them as ronin, masterless warriors condemned to wander in shame. In this pyramid, where would you belong? The harsh truth is that you would not belong anywhere. Without lineage, without ties, without mastery of customs and language, you would stand outside the entire structure. And in a society where being outside the hierarchy meant being a threat to order, your chances of survival would be grim. The pyramid was not just a system of classes, it was the backbone of Japanese feudal life, a web of obligations and duties that kept society from collapsing into chaos. Yet for the individual trapped within it, the system was a prison. And for you, arriving without warning or preparation, it would be a death sentence. When most people think of samurai, they imagine noble warriors in shining armor, bound by an unbreakable code of honor. Popular culture paints them as protectors of the weak, defenders of justice, and paragons of loyalty. But the samurai of feudal Japan were far more complex, and far more dangerous, than that romanticized image suggests. To live among them was to exist in a world of constant vigilance, where one wrong move could provoke sudden, merciless violence. If you crossed paths with a samurai in daily life, survival would depend on your ability to navigate their pride, their authority, and their deadly weapons. The samurai were not merely soldiers. They were the ruling class of warriors who formed the backbone of the shogunate system. Bound to their daimyo, they served as administrators, tax enforcers, and sometimes executioners. They were the visible face of feudal power, carrying with them the authority of the state. When a samurai walked through the streets, people lowered their eyes, bowed deeply, and made way. To fail in these gestures was not just rude, it could be fatal. One of the most terrifying aspects of samurai authority was the right of kirisut gomen, literally, authorization to cut and leave. This legal privilege allowed a samurai to strike down a commoner who disrespected him, whether through words, actions, or perceived insolence. Imagine bumping shoulders with a samurai in a crowded marketplace, stammering an apology in broken Japanese. If he decided your bow was not low enough or your tone too casual, his hand might flash to his katana, and your life would end in a spray of blood on the dirt. There would be no trial, no appeal, no consequences for your killer. The sword was both weapon and law. The katana itself, often mythologized today as a near-magical blade, was indeed a terrifying symbol of power. Forged through painstaking labor, folded steel upon steel, it was sharp enough to sever limbs with a single stroke. To the samurai, the sword was more than a tool, it was the soul of their identity, the mark of their status. To draw it was an act of ultimate seriousness, for once unsheathed, etiquette demanded it taste blood before being returned. For you, the presence of such weapons all around would be a constant reminder that survival depended on absolute caution. But the danger of samurai extended beyond random violence. They were also instruments of social control. Peasants who resisted taxation found themselves beaten or executed by samurai enforcers. Farmers who tried to flee their land risked being hunted down, their families punished in their stead. Even within towns, merchants and artisans lived under the watchful eyes of the warrior class, their prosperity tolerated only so long as it served the needs of their lords. The ideal of Bushido, often celebrated today, was not a code of kindness but one of absolute loyalty, honor, and readiness for death. To a samurai, personal survival was less important than obedience to his lord. If ordered to march into battle, he did so without hesitation, knowing that dishonor or cowardice was worse than death itself. If he failed in his duties or brought shame upon his name, the ultimate atonement was seppuku, ritual suicide by disembowelment. This gruesome act, often performed in front of witnesses, was meant to cleanse dishonor through suffering. For you, watching or even hearing of such an event would be horrifying. For samurai, it was an accepted reality. The presence of samurai also shaped daily life in ways you might not expect. Markets closed early if warriors passed through, fearful of drunken brawls or sudden violence. Villagers whispered about the temperaments of the samurai stationed nearby, knowing that offending them could bring ruin to the entire community. Even clothing and tools were regulated. Commoners were forbidden to wear certain colors, carry certain weapons, or display symbols that might suggest equality with the warrior class. Every gesture of daily existence reinforced the gulf between samurai and everyone else. And samurai themselves were far from uniform paragons of virtue. Some were disciplined and scholarly, trained not only in martial arts but in poetry, calligraphy, and strategy. Others, particularly in times of peace, turned to drinking, gambling, and abuse of their power. A drunken samurai with a short temper could be more dangerous than a thief in the night, for the thief risked punishment, but the samurai's status shielded him from consequence. Even for the samurai, life was not easy. Their loyalty to their daimyo was absolute, and disobedience meant ruin. When a lord fell from power, his samurai became ronin, masterless warriors who wandered the land in shame. Many became mercenaries, bodyguards, or even bandits. The image of the wandering swordsman, so beloved in fiction, was in reality a tragic figure, often hungry, desperate, and despised by society. If you encountered such a man, you would not find a romantic hero but a dangerous outcast, his sword as quick to turn against you as it was against his enemies. Warfare itself amplified the samurai's role as enforcers of fear. Battles between rival daimyo could leave entire villages burned, crops destroyed, and survivors enslaved or executed. Samurai armies marched across provinces, seizing food and supplies, conscripting peasants, and leaving devastation in their wake. For commoners, the sight of banners rising on the horizon was not a symbol of glory but a herald of death and ruin. If you were caught in such a campaign, your survival would be a matter of luck, whether you were trampled, cut down, or left to starve in the aftermath. Even during times of peace, samurai violence lingered. Duels were common, sparked by slights or challenges to honor. Streets could erupt in sudden fights, leaving blood pooled on cobblestones while onlookers dared not intervene. The idea of law enforcement as we know it did not exist. Instead, order was maintained through fear of the warrior class. To live under such conditions meant walking through a minefield of potential conflict, where a single careless act could ignite disaster. For women, the presence of samurai carried its own dangers. Though some women of samurai families trained in martial arts to defend their homes, most common women lived under the constant threat of exploitation. The word of a samurai outweighed that of any peasant, leaving women vulnerable to abuse with no recourse. Survival meant silence, obedience, and invisibility. Perhaps the most unsettling truth about the samurai is that their power rested not on fairness but on dominance. Their role was not to protect the weak but to ensure the system endured, to keep the peasants tied to their fields, the merchants in their stalls, and the artisans at their workbenches. They were the sword arm of feudal Japan, and to cross them was to court death. As an outsider, you would not be shielded by Bushido's lofty ideals. You would not be seen as an equal or a guest, but as a potential threat, an intruder, or at best, a curiosity. Any misstep, failing to bow deeply enough, speaking too casually, handling an object with the wrong hand, could draw suspicion or outrage. Surviving in the presence of samurai would require constant submission, absolute deference, and the abandonment of any sense of personal pride. In truth, the samurai were both the embodiment of feudal Japan's beauty and the reason for its terror. They wrote poetry about the fleeting blossoms of spring even as they cut men down in the street. They admired the delicate rituals of the tea ceremony even as they enforced taxation that starved villages. They could recite verses about honor while plunging their blades into unarmed peasants. To live among them was to live under the shadow of the sword, a shadow from which there was no escape. For you, thrust into this world, the samurai would not be romantic figures to admire but forces of constant fear. You would walk in silence, bow at every turn, and pray each day that your life would not be ended on a whim. Their discipline, their weapons, and their authority made them untouchable. And for everyone else, peasant, merchant, or stranger, they made survival a daily struggle against both oppression and death. If there is one truth about feudal Japan, it is this: the vast majority of its people were peasants. They lived not in castles, not in bustling towns, but in small villages scattered across valleys and mountainsides, bound to the soil and to the demands of their lords. To be a peasant in feudal Japan was to live a life of endless labor, fragile security, and crushing dependence on forces far beyond your control. If you were thrust into this world, it is almost certain that this would be the role you would occupy, not a samurai, not a lord, but a farmer scratching a living from the earth. And survival here was as precarious as a candle flame in the wind. Peasant life revolved around rice. Rice was not only food but also currency, the measure of wealth and the basis of taxation. Daimyo calculated their domain's prosperity in koku, a unit of rice supposedly equal to the amount one man ate in a year. Every harvest was tallied, every grain counted, and peasants bore the responsibility of producing enough not only to feed themselves but also to satisfy the endless demands of their lords. The rhythm of peasant existence followed the seasons. Spring meant planting, summer meant tending, autumn meant harvest, and winter meant enduring the cold with whatever stores remained. Each stage demanded brutal labor. Rice paddies had to be flooded, seedlings transplanted by hand, weeds pulled, and pests battled. Work began before dawn and often continued until after dark. Tools were simple, bodies were bent, and backs ached from endless repetition. You might imagine this life as one of peaceful connection to nature, but the reality was sweat, mud, hunger, and exhaustion. And the harvest was never truly theirs. Taxes could claim up to half of what they produced, leaving families with only the bare minimum to survive. If a harvest was poor, the burden did not lessen. The lord's demands remained the same, and peasants had to make up the shortfall however they could. Often this meant going hungry, selling possessions, or borrowing from merchants, sinking into debts that could never be repaid. Hunger was a constant companion. Rice was supplemented with millet, barley, or vegetables, but meals were meager and protein was scarce. Fish provided some nourishment near rivers or coasts, but inland villages often lacked even that. Meat was rare, both by custom and necessity, as raising animals for food was considered wasteful compared to using land for crops. When harvests failed because of floods, droughts, or insect swarms, famine followed swiftly. Starvation did not discriminate, though peasants always suffered first and most. Historical records tell of parents selling their children into servitude just to keep them alive, of entire villages collapsing, of desperate families scavenging bark, roots, and even dirt to stave off hunger. If you found yourself in such a situation, your modern body, unaccustomed to scarcity, would wither rapidly. Survival meant enduring not days or weeks of hunger but sometimes months or years. The lord's samurai enforcers ensured taxes were collected, no matter the hardship it caused. Villages were collectively responsible, meaning if one family failed, others had to make up the difference. This collective burden created a culture of surveillance, where neighbors kept close watch on each other, ensuring no one shirked duty. For you, used to privacy and personal freedom, this lack of autonomy would feel suffocating. Payment was often not just in rice but in labor. Peasants were required to help build roads, repair castles, and perform other tasks demanded by their lords. These corvée duties took them away from their own fields, compounding their struggles. Refusal was not an option. Punishment ranged from beatings to execution, sometimes extended to the entire family as a warning to others. Peasant villages were small, clustered communities of thatched huts with earthen floors. They lacked luxuries, and even basics like clean water and proper sanitation were scarce. Waste and refuse attracted disease, and epidemics could sweep through with devastating speed. Families lived in cramped quarters, with smoke from hearth fires filling the air and soot clinging to walls. Clothes were patched and repatched, often handed down through generations until they were little more than rags. Despite these hardships, village life was tightly bound by community. Festivals, rituals, and shared labor helped sustain spirits. Shinto shrines or Buddhist temples offered some solace, marking the cycles of planting and harvest with ceremonies. Yet even these were tinged with obligation. Festivals often included offerings to the local lord, and temples collected their own dues. Faith was less a refuge than another structure reinforcing duty. For peasants, survival was always precarious. Disease could strike without warning, taking children, parents, or entire families. A fire could sweep through a village, destroying homes built of wood and straw in minutes. Bandits or soldiers could raid, leaving devastation in their wake. Floods washed away fields, droughts baked the soil, earthquakes shattered homes. There was no insurance, no aid, no safety net. Misfortune meant ruin, and ruin meant death. For women, life was doubly harsh. They rose before dawn to cook, fetch water, care for children, and labor in the fields beside their husbands. Marriage was often arranged, and their value tied to their ability to bear children and contribute to farm work. If a husband died, widows might inherit his role, but more often they faced remarriage or poverty. Daughters could be sold into servitude during times of famine, while sons were expected to carry on the endless cycle of labor. Though peasants were often depicted as passive, history records moments of resistance. Villages sometimes rose in revolt against unbearable taxes or cruel officials. These uprisings, known as ikki, could swell into large movements, with peasants storming castles or refusing tribute. Yet such rebellions were dangerous and rarely successful. Samurai armies crushed most with ruthless efficiency, slaughtering rebels and leaving villages in ashes. To resist was to gamble not just with your own life but with the lives of everyone around you. For a modern outsider, the peasant's life would be nearly impossible to endure. Your body, untrained for backbreaking field work, would falter under the relentless pace. Your stomach, used to abundant and varied food, would shrink and weaken under constant hunger. Your mind, shaped by ideas of freedom and choice, would recoil against the inescapable obligations of lord, village, and family. And worst of all, you would have no means of escape. There were no open frontiers to flee to, no distant lands where peasants could carve out independent lives. The land belonged to the lords, the labor belonged to the lords, and the people themselves belonged to the lords. To run was to risk death. To resist was to invite ruin. The only option was obedience, endurance, and hope that the next harvest would be kinder. For the peasants of feudal Japan, survival meant bending without breaking, laboring without rest, and accepting a life of hardship as inevitable. For you, suddenly thrust into their world, it would mean facing a reality where every breath was hard-won, every meal uncertain, and every day a battle against forces you could not control. If there is one thread that ran through the lives of nearly all people in feudal Japan, it was hunger. While the castles of daimyo stood tall, filled with silks, scrolls, and warriors armed with polished blades, the peasants and common folk who sustained that world often hovered on the brink of starvation. Famine was not an occasional disaster but a recurring shadow, and winters in particular brought hardship that could strip away entire communities. For an outsider dropped into this world, hunger and cold would be among the greatest and most immediate threats to survival. The Japanese archipelago is mountainous, with limited arable land. Only a fraction of the terrain could support rice paddies, and even that was vulnerable to the whims of nature. Floods, droughts, typhoons, and earthquakes could devastate crops, leaving villages with little to eat. Because rice was both sustenance and tax, peasants were often forced to surrender their grain to lords and samurai even when their families faced empty bowls. What remained was stretched thin, porridge diluted with water, meals bulked out with millet or barley, pickled vegetables rationed carefully through the winter months. For the wealthy, food could be abundant and refined. Lords dined on rice polished to gleaming white, accompanied by fish, meat, and delicacies imported through trade. For peasants, meals were far simpler and often insufficient. You might find yourself chewing on thin gruel twice a day, your body weakening steadily from lack of calories. Modern people, used to steady diets, would quickly lose weight, their strength sapped before the next planting season even began. The winters of feudal Japan could be especially merciless. Snow-blanketed northern provinces, rivers froze and fields lay dormant. Food stores dwindled rapidly, and families rationed every grain. Hunger gnawed at bellies as meals grew smaller and days grew longer. Children cried through the night, too weak to play, while parents faced the impossible decision of whether to eat now or save for tomorrow. In extreme winters, starvation became widespread. Chronicles from the Edo period describe villagers boiling tree bark or mixing clay into thin soups in desperate attempts to quiet their stomachs. Corpses lined roadsides, the dead too numerous or weakly mourned to receive proper burials. If you were cast into this world without preparation, the cold alone could kill you. Without proper clothing, layers of hemp or cotton quilted against the chill, you would not last long in the drafty huts that peasants called home. Fires provided some warmth, but fuel was scarce and smoke filled the air, stinging eyes and choking lungs. Survival meant enduring bitter cold on an empty stomach. Throughout Japan's history, famines struck again and again. The Great Tenmei Famine of the late 18th century, for instance, lasted several years and killed hundreds of thousands. Crop failures, volcanic eruptions, and poor weather combined to create devastation. People resorted to eating whatever they could find: grass, roots, leather from sandals, even corpses in the most desperate cases. Banditry increased, villages collapsed, and the countryside echoed with the wails of the starving. Earlier centuries saw similar horrors. Droughts could wither fields before seedlings matured. Insect plagues could strip paddies bare in days. Entire provinces might go without sufficient food, forcing migration or mass death. The sheer frequency of these disasters meant that hunger was not an aberration but a grim rhythm of life. Each year, peasants prayed for good harvests, yet braced themselves for the possibility that nature or fate would betray them. Hunger did not act alone, it opened the door to disease. Malnutrition weakened bodies, making them vulnerable to epidemics that spread rapidly through villages. Beriberi, caused by vitamin deficiencies from polished rice diets, left victims weak and swollen. Outbreaks of smallpox, measles, or plague tore through communities already stretched to the brink. In crowded huts with poor sanitation, disease spread easily, turning hunger into death on a massive scale. For children, the effects were especially severe. Many did not survive past infancy, their small bodies unable to withstand prolonged malnourishment. Mothers, themselves weakened by lack of food, struggled to produce milk. Families might choose to prioritize feeding older children, leaving infants to fade quietly in the corner. For an outsider, watching such choices would be unbearable, but for peasants, it was an all-too-common reality. Despite the overwhelming challenges, peasants developed ways to cope with scarcity. Pickling and fermenting vegetables extended their lifespan, while rice bran and miso provided some essential nutrients. Villagers hunted small animals, foraged for wild plants, or fished rivers when possible. Communal storage systems were sometimes established, though these were often depleted by taxation or theft. Religious rituals also played a role. Villages offered prayers and sacrifices to Shinto deities for good harvests, or turned to Buddhist temples for guidance and solace. Faith helped people endure the unendurable, even if it could not fill empty stomachs. Rituals around planting and harvest reinforced communal bonds, reminding peasants that their suffering was shared. Yet even with these strategies, survival was not guaranteed. A bad year could wipe out entire generations, leaving villages abandoned, fields untended, and graves overgrown. Hunger is not only physical, it gnaws at the mind. Chronic malnutrition dulled concentration, sapped energy, and frayed tempers. Families quarreled, neighbors turned against one another, and despair settled over entire villages. Some peasants abandoned their homes in search of food, only to collapse on the roadside. Others turned to theft, risking execution if caught. Women were sometimes sold to towns as servants or concubines, their families sacrificing them for a chance at survival. For you, accustomed to supermarkets overflowing with food, the psychological shock of constant hunger would be overwhelming. The thought of going to bed night after night with your stomach empty, of seeing your strength fail while work remained unrelenting, would erode your will to live. Modern resilience is often built on stability and abundance. Remove those and despair would quickly follow. Perhaps the most bitter truth was the indifference of the ruling classes. While peasants starved, daimyo and samurai often continued to demand their share of rice. Castles remained stocked, banquets were held, and warriors feasted while the common people died in ditches. Some lords enacted relief measures, but others tightened their grip, punishing villages for failing to deliver quotas. To live in such a world was to understand that your suffering mattered little to those above you. You were a resource, not a person. If dropped into feudal Japan during a famine or winter, your survival chances would be slim. Your body, used to plentiful calories, would weaken quickly. Without the endurance born of a lifetime of scarcity, you would collapse far sooner than those hardened by hunger. Your mind, shocked by deprivation, might push you to rash decisions, stealing, fleeing, begging, that would mark you for punishment. And even if you somehow endured, the constant cycle of scarcity would break you down. Each harvest would be a gamble, each winter a test, each famine a nightmare that could return at any time. There was no stability, no assurance, no guarantee that tomorrow would bring food. The peasants of feudal Japan lived in this uncertainty as a matter of course, but for you, it would be a slow, inescapable death sentence. Hunger and cold were as much weapons of control as swords and spears. They kept peasants bound to their lords, desperate to survive, too weak to resist. And in this struggle, beauty and culture, tea ceremonies, poetry, blossoms, were luxuries reserved for those who did not worry where their next meal would come from. For the vast majority, life was not about living well but simply about living at all. If hunger and cold didn't kill you in feudal Japan, disease likely would. For all the elegance and refinement associated with the era, its castles, calligraphy, and cherry blossoms, life was constantly threatened by invisible enemies. Epidemics swept through villages and cities with terrifying regularity, medical knowledge was limited and often ineffective, and superstition dictated much of how people understood illness. To live in this world meant accepting that death could arrive suddenly, cruelly, and without explanation. For a modern outsider, the medical landscape of feudal Japan would be more than unfamiliar. It would be deadly. In today's world, we are protected by antibiotics, vaccines, hospitals, and sanitation systems that shield us from the most dangerous diseases. In feudal Japan, none of these existed. Illnesses that we consider minor today, such as influenza, measles, or strep throat, could be lethal then. The common cold might progress into pneumonia, untreated wounds could turn septic, and fevers could burn unchecked until the body gave in. The average person in feudal Japan had little understanding of germs or infection. Disease was often explained through spiritual or cosmic terms. Imbalances in the body, divine punishment, or malevolent spirits. Remedies were drawn from traditional Chinese medicine, herbal treatments, and religious rituals. While some herbs had real medicinal effects, many treatments were useless or harmful. For someone accustomed to modern healthcare, surviving even a simple illness in this environment would be a gamble. Japan's population was periodically devastated by epidemics. Smallpox, introduced centuries earlier, became a recurring nightmare. Records describe entire villages reduced to silence, with corpses stacked in temple courtyards. Survivors were often scarred for life, their faces marked by pitted skin, but many did not live to bear those marks. Measles followed a similar pattern, striking children in particular. Whooping cough, tuberculosis, and influenza also swept through communities, carried easily in crowded towns or villages where people lived in close quarters. When food shortages weakened immune systems, outbreaks were even deadlier. In some cases, entire regions saw population declines so sharp that farmland was abandoned and villages disappeared altogether. Plague, too, struck Japan, likely arriving through trade routes from China. The sight of sudden fevers, blackened skin, and mass death terrified people who had no tools to fight it. Families often abandoned sick members, fearing contagion but not understanding its causes. For an outsider suddenly immersed in such an epidemic, survival odds would be vanishingly small. The everyday environment of feudal Japan created fertile ground for disease. Villages relied on rivers and wells for water, but contamination was common. Human and animal waste seeped into streams, and without modern sewage systems, drinking water often carried deadly pathogens. Bathing was practiced, especially in urban areas influenced by Buddhist customs, but hygiene alone could not stop the spread of waterborne illnesses like dysentery or cholera. Houses were crowded and poorly ventilated, especially during cold seasons when families huddled around smoky fires. Respiratory illnesses spread easily in these conditions. Insects and rodents, ever present in grain stores and thatched roofs, carried their own share of diseases. Even lice and fleas were daily companions for peasants, itching reminders of a body vulnerable to sickness. For a modern person accustomed to clean tap water, pest control, and personal hygiene standards, adjusting to this world would be shocking. The constant exposure to parasites, contaminated food, and unclean living conditions would almost guarantee illness. Though limited by their era, Japanese healers did attempt to combat disease. Medicine in feudal Japan was heavily influenced by Chinese practices, particularly the theories of yin and yang, and the balance of internal energies. Treatments often involved herbal remedies, acupuncture, and moxibustion, the burning of herbs on the skin to stimulate healing. Some herbs used had real medicinal properties: ginger for nausea, ginseng for energy, licorice root for inflammation. However, doses were imprecise, and remedies often mixed useful plants with ineffective or dangerous ones. Bloodletting was occasionally practiced, as was the use of mercury or other toxins in attempts to purge illness. Religious and superstitious practices accompanied these treatments, with prayers, charms, or offerings made to ward off spirits believed to cause disease. For you, falling ill in this world would mean surrendering yourself to treatments that might help, or might hasten your decline. The idea of surgery was terrifyingly crude, performed without anesthesia, sterilization, or an understanding of infection. Even a minor cut could spiral into death by blood poisoning. Perhaps the most tragic reality of feudal Japan was the fate of children. Infant mortality rates were staggeringly high. Many babies died within their first year of life from malnutrition, infection, or congenital conditions that could not be treated. Mothers expected to lose some of their children. Grief was common, and yet life demanded endurance. For families who struggled through famine or plague, children were especially vulnerable. A cough could turn fatal, a fever could sweep away a life overnight. Some infants were abandoned during hard times, their parents unable to feed them. The sight of small graves outside villages was all too common. For you, accustomed to modern child survival rates, such losses would be unbearable. Life expectancy in feudal Japan was brutally short compared to today. Most peasants who survived childhood could expect to live into their 30s or 40s if fortunate, though some reached old age. However, war, famine, disease, and hard labor often cut lives short long before then. Death was a daily presence, in the fields, on the roadsides, in the villages. Women faced particular risks in childbirth, where complications often proved fatal. With little knowledge of sanitation or emergency care, both mothers and infants frequently perished. For men, injuries sustained in battle or labor might fester into lethal infections. To live long was to defy odds, and even then, old age did not guarantee peace. Illness often ravaged the elderly without mercy. In the absence of scientific understanding, people turned to religion and superstition to explain illness. Shinto practices emphasized purification rituals, seeking to cleanse the body and spirit of corruption. Buddhist monks offered prayers, amulets, and rituals intended to drive away malevolent forces. Families might consult fortune tellers or healers who claimed to see the spiritual origins of sickness. These beliefs offered comfort if not cure. They gave suffering meaning, framing disease as part of a cosmic order or as punishment for sins. For peasants who had little control over their fates, such explanations softened despair. But for you, living in a world where disease is explained and treated scientifically, relying on rituals and charms would feel like surrendering yourself to ignorance and hopelessness. In a world so riddled with disease and so lacking in effective medicine, your chances of survival would be slim. A simple cut while working in the fields might turn gangrenous. A fever contracted in winter could spiral into pneumonia. An outbreak of smallpox could strike your village, leaving you either scarred or dead. Even if you avoided the worst epidemics, daily living conditions would wear you down. Parasites, contaminated water, and poor nutrition would weaken your body steadily. Without modern immunity, without vaccines, without antibiotics, you would be exposed to dangers at every turn. Survival in feudal Japan meant enduring sickness after sickness, never knowing which might be the one that claimed you. Death was constant, hovering at the edges of daily life. For peasants, it was a companion accepted with resignation. But for you, used to modern medicine and long life expectancy, the relentless presence of disease would be a crushing, inescapable reality. You would not merely struggle to survive, you would almost certainly fail. Feudal Japan was a land ruled not only by warriors and lords but by fear. Laws existed, but they were not designed to ensure fairness or justice in the modern sense. They were designed to preserve hierarchy, protect the powerful, and control the powerless. If you found yourself living in this world, the boundaries between minor offense and death sentence would be razor thin. Survival required navigating a system where even small mistakes could lead to disproportionate and often gruesome punishments. Justice in feudal Japan was administered at multiple levels. Local village elders could enforce petty rules, but ultimate authority lay with the daimyo and their samurai enforcers. These lords were responsible for maintaining order in their domains, collecting taxes and suppressing rebellion. Law was a tool for social control, not a shield for the individual. Commoners had almost no recourse if wronged by a member of the samurai class, and disputes among peasants themselves were often settled brutally, sometimes with the death of the guilty party or, in extreme cases, the entire household. The emphasis was not on rehabilitation or fairness but on deterrence. Punishments were public, meant to instill fear, and often designed to humiliate as much as to harm. For a modern person, accustomed to legal protections, trial by jury, and appeals, the feudal justice system would appear terrifyingly arbitrary. Crimes were not always what we would expect today. Stealing a small amount of rice, failing to pay taxes, or insulting a samurai could all be treated as capital offenses. Debt was a particularly dangerous trap. Peasants who borrowed money from merchants or neighbors could find themselves in a spiral of penalties, forced labor, and, ultimately, corporal punishment if they defaulted. Even minor infractions were punished harshly. Failing to bow correctly to a samurai, speaking out of turn, or accidentally damaging someone of higher rank's property could trigger severe reprisals. The samurai's legal privileges, such as kirasut gomen, meant that commoners had almost no protection. Your life could be ended simply because you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. When accusations were serious, punishments could be excruciatingly cruel. Torture was a legitimate tool to extract confessions or punish offenders. Techniques included beatings, exposure to extreme cold or heat, and stretching on wooden racks. While the goal was to maintain order, these methods were designed to terrify others into obedience. The psychological trauma of witnessing such acts reinforced fear at every level of society. Executions were public spectacles. Decapitation by sword, crucifixion, boiling alive, and even slow, drawn-out dismemberment were not uncommon for serious crimes or rebellion. Families of the guilty were often punished as well, a practice meant to discourage dissent and rebellion. If you were a stranger in feudal Japan, even a misunderstanding could result in death, and there would be no way to appeal or defend yourself. A central pillar of feudal justice was the immunity of the samurai class. Samurai were both judge and enforcer, and their social status shielded them from prosecution. They could commit violence, theft, or even murder with relative impunity, provided they maintained their loyalty to their lord. For ordinary people, this meant that justice was unequal. Survival depended not only on obeying the law but also on avoiding the attention of those above you. The legal system of feudal Japan was as much psychological as it was practical. Public executions, grotesque punishments, and sudden acts of violence by samurai reinforced social hierarchies. Villagers were constantly reminded that failure, disrespect, or rebellion could lead to death. Fear was woven into daily life, from the ritual inspections of rice paddies to the enforcement of taxes and corvée labor. The emphasis on deterrence over fairness meant that the consequences of mistakes were often disproportionate. A farmer who neglected his duties during planting season might face flogging or execution if his failure affected the domain's productivity. Merchants who challenged guild rules risked confiscation of property or exile. Even children could be punished for the misdeeds of their parents, reinforcing the sense that no one was truly safe from the reach of authority. Though rebellion did occur, it was perilous. Peasants sometimes organized uprisings, known as ikki, to protest unbearable taxes or mistreatment. When these revolts were crushed, punishments were brutal. Leaders were executed publicly while villages were burned, crops destroyed, and survivors terrorized. Even participation in minor resistance could result in death or enslavement. Survival depended on submission, not courage, a bitter reality for anyone imagining that cleverness or bravery alone could protect them. Women faced unique risks under the feudal legal system. Their lives were heavily constrained by familial and social expectations, and they were punished not only for their own actions but for the misdeeds of husbands, sons, or fathers. Infidelity, even rumored, could result in severe punishment, including death. Widows who remarried without approval or failed to fulfill household duties might face social ostracism, economic hardship, or violence. A woman's survival depended on strict adherence to societal rules and deference to men of authority. Below the mainstream population were those deemed criminal or impure, such as the bureaucramen, who handled occupations associated with death and decay. These people were already marginalized, and any infraction could lead to harsh punishment. Their lives illustrate the extreme stratification of the legal system. Some people existed outside the protections afforded to even lowly peasants, constantly vulnerable to violence, ostracism, and exploitation. For a foreigner or stranger, the dangers multiplied. Without knowledge of customs, language, or expected behavior, even mundane actions could be interpreted as criminal. Mishandling an object, bowing incorrectly, or speaking casually could be taken as insult. Authorities were suspicious of outsiders, seeing them as potential spies, thieves, or troublemakers. Even a well-intentioned action could trigger punishment, and without advocates or allies, you would have no protection. Survival required vigilance at all times, and even then it might not be enough. In feudal Japan, the law was an omnipresent force, invisible and yet capable of sudden, lethal enforcement. Death could arrive for minor offenses, and punishments were designed to terrify rather than rehabilitate. The privileged classes wielded the law as a weapon, ensuring that the powerless remained obedient. For someone unversed in the nuances of etiquette, hierarchy, and obligation, the system was deadly. Every action, every word, every gesture carried weight. Misjudgments were punished harshly. Mistakes could be fatal. And even if you obeyed perfectly, you could still fall victim to the whims of powerful samurai or the misfortunes of the hierarchical system. The law in feudal Japan was not protection, it was a gauntlet, and surviving it required perfection, luck, and constant vigilance. Feudal Japan was a land perpetually on the brink of violence. Even in periods of relative peace, the threat of war lingered like a storm cloud over the landscape. Daimyo vied for power, samurai fought for honor or survival, and peasants and commoners were caught in the crossfire. For anyone unaccustomed to such constant instability, the reality of life in Japan's feudal era would be terrifying. Survival depended not just on avoiding starvation and disease but on navigating a society in which violence could erupt at any moment. Unlike the organized industrial warfare of modern times, battles in feudal Japan were intensely personal and chaotic. Armies were smaller, often numbering in the tens of thousands, and engagements were direct and brutal. Samurai clashed with swords and spears, archers rained arrows from the flanks, and foot soldiers, armed with clubs, farming tools, or bows, filled in the ranks. Battles often decimated villages and farmland as armies requisitioned food and supplies, leaving civilian populations to starve or flee. For peasants, war was rarely about politics or ideology. It was about survival. Fields were burned, homes destroyed, and families displaced. A peasant could work for years to cultivate rice, only to watch an invading force seize it for a distant lord's army. Famine and poverty often followed in the wake of conflict, ensuring that the hardships of everyday life multiplied during wartime. For an outsider, experiencing this firsthand would be disorienting and overwhelming. The rules of society could vanish under the chaos of battle. Civil conflict was endemic to feudal Japan. Discontent among peasants, rivalries among daimyo, and power struggles within the samurai class frequently erupted into rebellion. The Ikki revolts, organized by villages or guilds, sought to challenge unfair taxation or oppressive rulers. While sometimes successful in small, localized ways, these uprisings were typically crushed with brutal efficiency. Samurai armies would storm villages, executing leaders publicly, looting homes, and destroying crops. Participation in rebellion, intentional or accidental, was perilous, and for an outsider, even being caught nearby could be fatal. The constant threat of rebellion also shaped the behavior of samurai. Loyalty to one's lord was paramount, and suspicion of treachery was ever present. Alliances could shift overnight, and a samurai who fell out of favor might find himself a ronin, wandering with no protection, hunted by former allies, or forced into banditry. The instability of the social order meant that even those at the top were not immune to violence, though the consequences were far harsher for the powerless. The human toll of war was staggering. Villages caught between warring factions were looted, burned, or forcibly conscripted into armies. Peasants might be pressed into labor, building fortifications or carrying supplies for soldiers who regarded them as expendable. Children were orphaned, women were sometimes abducted, and the elderly were left to fend for themselves. Even towns that escaped direct conflict suffered from economic disruption, food shortages, and the psychological trauma of knowing that violence could return at any moment. Civil war also brought diseases in its wake. Armies moved en masse, carrying illnesses into previously isolated areas. Malnutrition and poor sanitation among refugees increased vulnerability to epidemics. For a modern person suddenly immersed in this environment, it would be nearly impossible to avoid illness, starvation, or injury. Survival required not only physical endurance but constant vigilance, luck, and a deep understanding of the shifting social landscape. When war did occur, samurai led the charge. They were highly trained, disciplined, and often ruthless. For them, the battlefield was a place to demonstrate skill, loyalty, and courage. Their code of Bushido emphasized honor above life, meaning they would fight to the death rather than retreat. To encounter a samurai army as a civilian was terrifying. Mistaken presence on a battlefield could be deadly. There was no protection for non-combatants, and the distinction between peasant, merchant, or outsider was irrelevant when chaos reigned. Even after the fighting, the samurai's presence could be oppressive. Armies often requisitioned supplies, levied forced labor, and punished villages for perceived disloyalty. Surviving the battle did not guarantee safety. The aftermath could be as lethal as combat itself. Japan's mountainous terrain shaped conflict in unique ways. Rivers, forests, and steep hills could provide temporary shelter or strategic advantage, but they also trapped civilians when armies advanced. Refugees fled to mountains or remote villages, yet isolation did not guarantee safety. Starvation, exposure, and disease were constant threats. To survive in feudal Japan meant understanding the terrain, the movements of armies, and the loyalties of local lords, a nearly impossible task for someone unfamiliar with the landscape. The constant presence of war created a society in which fear was a daily reality. Peasants and townspeople lived with the knowledge that death or displacement could strike without warning. Families were separated as members fled or were conscripted. Children grew up with stories of massacres, fires, and sieges, shaping a worldview in which life was fragile and uncertain. For an outsider, the psychological shock of witnessing relentless conflict would be profound, amplifying the physical dangers of survival. If you were transported to feudal Japan during a period of conflict, your modern skills would do little to protect you. A smartphone or compass would be useless. Your ability to navigate social hierarchies would matter more than physical strength, but even then, knowledge alone could not guarantee safety. Random violence, disease, starvation, and exposure were constant threats. The most effective survival strategy would be invisibility, moving quietly, avoiding notice, and praying that armies passed by without incident. Even this would not be foolproof. Battles were chaotic and unpredictable. Samurai might raid a village for resources, rebels might set fire to homes, or a peasant's accidental misstep could trigger punishment. Survival required humility, constant alertness, and a willingness to accept that luck often mattered more than skill or courage. Feudal Japan's landscape of war and rebellion was unforgiving. Unlike modern conflicts, which often spare civilians or provide organized aid, feudal warfare treated peasants and outsiders as expendable. Starvation, disease, and violence were inescapable realities. Even if you avoided the battlefield, the social and economic disruption caused by conflict would threaten your ability to eat, find shelter, or remain healthy. For the modern person, accustomed to relative stability, peace, and legal protections, the world of feudal Japan would be a constant shock. Every step, every word, every gesture could have consequences that ranged from minor humiliation to sudden death. The omnipresence of war magnified every other danger: hunger, disease, abuse, and injustice. Survival was possible only through obedience, secrecy, and luck, and even then it was far from guaranteed. In this world, there were no heroes waiting to rescue you. There were no hospitals, no police, no social safety nets. There were only power, violence, and the fragile will to endure. Life in feudal Japan was harsh, unpredictable, and often cruel. Hunger, disease, violence, and social oppression were constants. In such a world, people turned to religion and superstition not merely for solace, but as a framework to understand why life was so difficult and how to survive within it. For a modern outsider, the spiritual landscape would seem confusing, mysterious, and occasionally terrifying. Yet for the Japanese of the era, belief was inseparable from daily life, shaping decisions, behavior, and even survival strategies. Shinto, Japan's indigenous religion, centered on the worship of kami, spiritual forces present in nature, objects, and ancestors. Rivers, mountains, trees, and even household objects could possess a spiritual essence. This worldview created a constant awareness of the sacred and the dangerous. Natural disasters, failed crops, and illness were often interpreted as signs of displeased kami. To survive, peasants and villagers performed rituals, made offerings, and maintained shrines to appease these forces. The rituals themselves reinforced social cohesion. Festivals marking planting or harvest seasons were not only religious observances but community events, ensuring that everyone participated in the cycles that governed agricultural life. Bowing to shrines, cleaning sacred spaces, and offering portions of rice or sake were daily practices that reminded villagers of their dependence on both the spiritual and material worlds. For an outsider unfamiliar with these customs, failure to participate, or to show proper respect, could mark you as disrespectful or even dangerous. Social ostracism, suspicion, or reprimand could follow, making integration into daily life even more difficult. Alongside Shinto, Buddhism offered philosophical frameworks and solace. Zen Buddhism in particular influenced samurai and commoners alike, emphasizing meditation, discipline, and acceptance of impermanence. Life was seen as suffering, dukkha, and detachment from worldly desires was a path to enlightenment. For peasants, Buddhist temples served multiple purposes: spiritual guidance, education, and sometimes refuge. Monks offered prayers for good harvests, healing rituals, and counsel in times of crisis. The concepts of karma and reincarnation provided a moral framework, suggesting that present suffering could be offset by virtuous actions and spiritual awareness. However, Buddhism also reinforced social hierarchies. The notion of accepting one's lot in life aligned with the rigid class structure. Peasants learned to endure hardship as a moral obligation, while samurai interpreted the teachings as a way to face death honorably. For someone suddenly living in this world, the pervasive presence of Buddhism could feel both reassuring and oppressive. It offered meaning yet demanded acceptance of suffering as inevitable. Beyond formal religion, superstition permeated daily life. Illness could be attributed to malevolent spirits. Strange noises in the night might signal a ghost or demon. Families hung talismans, practiced protective rituals, and followed countless taboos designed to prevent disaster. Failure to adhere to these practices could result in social censure, ostracism, or even accusations of inviting misfortune. Astrology, divination, and fortune-telling were also common. Before planting crops, arranging a wedding, or traveling, people often consulted priests or local soothsayers. Decisions were made based on the alignment of celestial bodies or perceived signs from the natural world. Modern readers might see this as irrational, but for feudal Japanese, such practices provided a sense of control over a world filled with uncertainty. Religious observances were often communal, binding villages and towns together. Seasonal festivals, celebrating planting, harvest, and local deities, offered moments of respite from labor, hunger, and fear. Dance, music, and ritual processions allowed people to express collective hopes, anxiety, and gratitude. Yet these festivals were not merely joyous events. They reinforced obedience, hierarchy, and conformity. Offerings to lords or samurai were sometimes required, reminding participants of their place in the social order. Participation in religious practice was as much about survival and social survival as it was about personal faith. For an outsider, navigating these rituals would require constant observation, humility, and careful imitation. Missteps could provoke suspicion or punishment. In a society marked by constant threat, hunger, disease, and violence, religion offered explanations that made suffering intelligible. Plagues were the result of karmic imbalance or vengeful spirits. Poor harvests were divine warnings, and misfortune was a test of virtue. By providing meaning to hardship, religion helped people endure what might otherwise be unbearable. Yet this explanatory framework could also be oppressive. Belief in inevitable suffering reinforced obedience and discouraged rebellion. Accepting one's lot was seen as morally superior, while questioning authority or resisting hardship could be framed as spiritual failure. For someone used to modern ideas of personal agency and justice, this would feel both alien and constraining. Daily life required constant attention to spiritual safety. Houses were cleansed and protected with charms. Small offerings were made to ward off illness or disaster. Villagers might carry protective amulets or follow rituals to avoid curses from spirits. The line between superstition and practical action was blurred. Adherence to ritual could literally influence survival, as those who ignored taboos risked ostracism, punishment, or social isolation. Even the samurai engaged in spiritual practices. Meditation before battle, purification rituals, and consultations with priests were common. While their motivations might differ, honor, courage, or luck, the emphasis on spiritual discipline permeated every level of society. For a modern person suddenly thrust into feudal Japan, understanding the spiritual and superstitious framework would be critical for survival. Ignorance of customs, failure to respect local beliefs, or rejection of rituals could provoke hostility or even fatal consequences. You could be accused of offending the gods, attracting misfortune, or defying the social order. Adapting would require humility, observation, and participation. Learning local rituals, carrying talismans, and showing reverence for both Shinto and Buddhist practices could mean the difference between acceptance and alienation, between life and death. Religion was inseparable from survival, weaving together morality, social cohesion, and practical caution in a world where chaos and suffering were constants. Even if you escaped famine, disease, and samurai enforcement, the spiritual world of feudal Japan posed its own challenges. Survival depended on more than food, shelter, or weapons. It required understanding an unseen landscape of spirits, omens, and moral obligations. Misjudging a ritual, failing to honor a deity, or offending a local priest could invite suspicion, social exclusion, or violent reprisal. For the modern outsider, the invisible yet pervasive power of religion and superstition would be overwhelming. Life was a balance between physical survival and spiritual caution, and mistakes in either realm could be deadly. The mental burden alone, constantly interpreting signs, performing rituals, and navigating unseen moral terrain, would be exhausting and unrelenting. In feudal Japan, survival was not just about enduring the physical hardships of hunger, disease, and violence. It was about existing in harmony with a spiritual framework that dictated behavior, shaped social hierarchies, and explained the inexplicable cruelty of life. For those unfamiliar with its rules, the struggle for meaning could be as lethal as famine or war. Life in feudal Japan was relentless, filled with hunger, disease, labor, and danger. For most people, death was not a distant inevitability, it was a constant companion. Aging brought its own challenges, compounded by a lifetime of hardship, and the legacy one left behind was often measured less by achievement than by survival and adherence to social duties. For a modern outsider, accustomed to medical care, retirement, and social support, the final stage of life in this era would be as harsh and unforgiving as youth or adulthood. For peasants, samurai, and commoners alike, aging was rarely a graceful process. By the time one reached 40 or 50, the body had endured decades of labor, poor nutrition, and repeated exposure to disease. Arthritis, weakened vision, and chronic illness were common. Simple tasks that once required little effort, carrying water, tending the fields, or walking to the market, could become exhausting, even impossible. Peasants were often forced to work as long as their bodies permitted, because idleness could mean starvation. Elderly women continued to cook, fetch water, and care for grandchildren, while men assisted in lighter agricultural tasks if able. Even samurai who survived battles into old age found themselves sidelined in their clans or forced to train younger warriors. Aging offered no guarantee of rest, comfort, or respect, only a gradual accumulation of hardship and vulnerability. A lifetime of labor, poor diet, and exposure to harsh weather left its mark. Bones became brittle, joints stiffened, and eyesight deteriorated. Chronic illnesses went untreated, and wounds sustained years earlier could reopen or fester. For an outsider accustomed to modern healthcare, witnessing the frailty of the elderly in feudal Japan would be shocking. Life expectancy was low, with many not surviving past their 40s, though a fortunate few reached their 60s or 70s. Those who did were admired for endurance, but survival did not equate to comfort. Even samurai, trained for battle and physically robust in youth, faced decline. The body that once wielded a sword with deadly precision eventually became slow and frail. Yet the societal expectation to maintain honor, discipline, and dignity remained. Old samurai might retreat into teaching, meditation, or administrative roles, but the specter of irrelevance loomed large. Aging was both a personal and social struggle. Death was omnipresent. Epidemics, famine, and warfare meant that neighbors, friends, and family members often passed away long before old age. Funerals were frequent events, and mourning was a routine part of life. For peasants, simple burials marked by wooden markers in village cemeteries were the norm. Wealthier families or samurai might have more elaborate ceremonies, but all were framed by Buddhist rituals emphasizing impermanence, mujo, and the inevitability of death. For an outsider, the frequency and immediacy of death could be psychologically overwhelming. Modern societies cushion individuals from death through hospitals, hospice care, and delayed exposure. In feudal Japan, mortality was immediate, visible, and often gruesome. Witnessing neighbors starve, fall ill, or die in accidents was a daily reality that shaped perceptions of life, society, and spirituality. Funerary rituals were deeply intertwined with religion. Shinto practices emphasized purification, while Buddhist ceremonies guided the soul toward the afterlife. Cremation became increasingly common, particularly from the Kamakura period onward, while burial practices varied by region and social class. Monks or priests oversaw prayers, offerings, and chanting, ensuring that the deceased spirit was honored and protected. For families, proper observance of these rituals was crucial. Failure could bring social stigma or fear of spiritual retribution. Ancestor worship remained a central practice, with the living providing offerings and prayers to maintain harmony and ensure protection. Life and death were not merely biological events, they were part of a moral and spiritual continuum. In feudal Japan, legacy was less about personal achievement and more about survival, obedience, and family continuity. Land, tools, or small savings were often passed down to children or younger relatives. For samurai, lineage, honor, and service records were preserved to maintain family reputation. For peasants, the continuation of the household, the cultivation of the land, and the care of the next generation were paramount. Death could also be disruptive. Premature death of a head of household could plunge families into poverty, debt, or vulnerability to exploitation. Widows and children faced economic precarity, while inheritance disputes sometimes led to conflict within villages. Life's fragility meant that preparing for one's death was as much practical as spiritual. Ensuring that family could survive after one's passing was a key responsibility. Living with constant proximity to death shaped psychological resilience and worldview. People developed acceptance of mortality from an early age, influenced by Buddhist teachings on impermanence. Fear of death coexisted with ritualized preparation. Prayers, offerings, and adherence to social duties helped mitigate anxiety. Stoicism, endurance, and humility were virtues cultivated through necessity. For a modern outsider, unaccustomed to such immediacy, the psychological burden would be immense. Every injury, every illness, and every sign of famine or disease would carry the weight of potential mortality. Survival required mental fortitude as much as physical endurance. Elderly individuals often found solace in religious practice, storytelling, and mentoring younger generations. They became repositories of wisdom, passing on agricultural knowledge, survival techniques, and moral guidance. Even amidst hardship, these roles provided meaning and maintained social cohesion. The continuity of family, community, and tradition became the ultimate measure of survival and legacy. Yet for those unable to fulfill these roles, orphans, widows, or disabled elders, aging could mean invisibility, neglect, and extreme vulnerability. In a society without social safety nets, the elderly relied on family and community. Isolation often led to suffering and death from neglect, malnutrition, or exposure. Even if you had navigated famine, disease, war, and social hierarchies successfully, aging in feudal Japan would present another formidable challenge. Your modern body, unaccustomed to decades of hard labor and minimal nutrition, would weaken rapidly. Chronic illness could incapacitate you, and without medical support, even minor ailments might prove fatal. Death was unavoidable, and preparation for it required knowledge of rituals, social obligations, and spiritual practices. Without these, you could face not only physical decline but social ostracism, leaving your family vulnerable. Survival was not just about prolonging life, it was about maintaining one's place in the social, economic, and spiritual order until the end. Ultimately, feudal Japan demanded endurance through every stage of life. From birth to old age, survival depended on navigating a world filled with relentless physical challenges, social hierarchies, spiritual obligations, and unpredictable danger. For a modern outsider, the final years would be as perilous as childhood, as unforgiving as a battlefield, and as unrelenting as a winter famine. A life well lived was measured not by personal satisfaction, comfort, or freedom, but by endurance, duty, and the preservation of one's family and community. For most, death was neither sudden nor heroic. It was inevitable, and survival until that point was itself a remarkable achievement. By the time you reached adulthood in feudal Japan, the accumulated hardships of life, famine, disease, violence, social oppression, and spiritual demands would already have tested every aspect of your body, mind, and spirit. For someone transported from the modern world, survival would be almost impossible. The challenges were systemic, omnipresent, and interlocking. Each difficulty alone, starvation, disease, war, would threaten life. Together, they formed a reality so harsh that adaptation without extraordinary skill, luck, or insider knowledge was nearly unthinkable. The first barrier would be your physical adaptation. Modern humans are accustomed to a world of calorie-dense food, limited manual labor, and climate-controlled environments. In feudal Japan, every day demanded relentless physical exertion. Fields had to be plowed, water carried, crops planted and harvested, and homes maintained, all without mechanized tools. Weakness brought punishment, starvation, or death. You would be unprepared for long winters, fevers from disease, or sudden injury while performing arduous labor. Even simple fatigue could be lethal if it prevented you from completing necessary tasks. For centuries, Japanese peasants and commoners built endurance from birth, conditioned to survive on minimal nutrition and constant exertion. Your body, lacking this lifelong conditioning, would give out long before you learned to navigate these demands. Food scarcity was another insurmountable challenge. Modern humans are accustomed to abundance and security. Even short-term deprivation can induce panic and poor decision-making. In feudal Japan, famine was recurrent. A single failed harvest could mean months of meager meals, diluted gruel, and starvation. Without knowledge of local edible plants, preservation techniques, or social coping strategies, you would quickly succumb to hunger. Even if you avoided starvation outright, chronic malnutrition would weaken your immune system, making disease far more deadly. Your energy would diminish, mental clarity would decline, and your ability to perform labor would falter. Hunger was not merely a threat to comfort, it was a daily killer, relentless and indiscriminate. Even with physical endurance, the lack of effective medicine would be lethal. Infectious diseases that are minor today, such as influenza, smallpox, or tuberculosis, were often fatal. Injuries that modern medicine treats easily could lead to gangrene or infection. Parasites, contaminated water, and poor sanitation would continually threaten health. Without familiarity with local remedies, herbal medicine, and religious or superstitious protective practices, your survival chances plummeted. Even experienced villagers often fell victim to epidemics. As a stranger, you would be highly exposed. Your modern immunity and mindset would not compensate for centuries of local adaptation. Survival required navigating a rigid social hierarchy and legal system designed to protect the powerful. Samurai held near-absolute authority, capable of punishing minor infractions with death. Local lords and village elders enforced laws arbitrarily, with fear as a primary tool of control. Ignorance of etiquette, social expectations, or the subtleties of deference could result in fatal consequences. Unlike modern societies with legal protections, checks and balances, or recourse for unjust punishment, feudal Japan offered no safety nets. Even a small error in behavior, bowing incorrectly, speaking out of turn, failing to recognize authority, could mark you for execution or exile. Modern individuals, untrained in this nuanced system, would struggle to survive under such constant social scrutiny. Even if you mastered physical labor, nutrition, and etiquette, feudal Japan's endemic violence would remain a formidable threat. Samurai battles, local uprisings, and armed banditry were routine realities. Villages could be destroyed overnight, crops stolen, and civilians executed. Survival depended not just on strength but on luck, stealth, and an understanding of the constantly shifting allegiances among lords, samurai, and peasants. Modern humans are ill-prepared for such unpredictability. In contemporary life, violence is rare and mediated through legal systems. In feudal Japan, conflict was immediate, personal, and often deadly. Even careful observation and avoidance might not prevent harm, particularly as an outsider unfamiliar with local power dynamics. Adaptation required more than physical, social, and strategic awareness. It demanded immersion into the spiritual and cultural framework of the time. Shinto rituals, Buddhist practices, and superstition dictated much of daily behavior. Ignoring or misunderstanding these customs could provoke social alienation or spiritual reprisal, both of which could threaten survival. You would need to perform daily offerings, participate in community rituals, and observe taboos. Mistakes were not merely socially awkward, they could mark you as dangerous, unlucky, or cursed, increasing the likelihood of punishment or ostracism. Modern people, accustomed to secular norms and rational explanations for events, would struggle to integrate into this spiritualized world. The greatest obstacle to survival was the cumulative effect of these challenges. Each domain, physical labor, nutrition, health, social navigation, violence, and spirituality, interacted with the others. Hunger weakened your immune system, making disease more likely. Disease impaired your ability to work or flee danger. Social mistakes could provoke punishment or exile, removing access to food or shelter. This interlocking system created a world in which mistakes, misfortune, or ignorance were often fatal. Unlike in modern life, where safety nets, medical care, and legal protections mitigate errors, in feudal Japan, a single misstep could trigger a cascade of deadly consequences. Survival required flawless execution across every aspect of life, a level of adaptation virtually impossible for someone suddenly thrust into that era. Even if, by luck or skill, you survived initial hardships, the mental strain would be immense. Constant fear of starvation, disease, social censure, and violence would erode your mental resilience. Modern humans are not conditioned for such relentless pressure. Anxiety, despair, and cognitive overload would accumulate, reducing decision-making ability and further endangering survival. The psychological burden was amplified by societal expectations. Endurance, obedience, and stoicism were necessary virtues. For an outsider unfamiliar with these values, failing to internalize them could provoke punishment or social exclusion, adding yet another layer of danger. Feudal Japan was a world designed for those born into it. Every aspect of life, work, diet, health, social conduct, spiritual practice, and self-protection, was interwoven with centuries of adaptation. Outsiders, no matter how intelligent, resourceful, or physically fit, would lack the instinctive knowledge, cultural understanding, and bodily conditioning required to navigate this environment. Even those who survived initial threats would face constant, cumulative pressures. Physical exhaustion, disease, social missteps, and psychological strain would compound until survival became impossible. Death was not only common, it was almost inevitable for those unable to integrate fully into the intricate, harsh, and unforgiving world of feudal Japan. In sum, you would fail to adapt because survival in feudal Japan required simultaneous mastery of multiple, interdependent domains: physical endurance, nutrition, disease management, social etiquette, combat avoidance, spiritual observance, and psychological resilience. Modern humans, untrained in these interconnected skills, would be exposed and vulnerable at every turn. The world was uncompromising. It demanded endurance, knowledge, and instinct honed over a lifetime. Without it, even the smallest mistake could trigger death. Starvation, disease, violence, social reprisal, or spiritual missteps. Anyone could be fatal, and together they made survival extraordinarily unlikely. Feudal Japan was beautiful, complex, and culturally rich, but it was also a crucible of life and death, where only those fully adapted to its rhythms could survive. For a modern outsider, no combination of cleverness or determination could overcome the relentless, interlocking dangers that defined every day from birth to the grave.